John always wanted to be invisible, to disappear from the world and live his life in solitude. But he never imagined that one day his wish would actually come true. It started with a strange feeling, like a tingling sensation all over his body. He thought it was just a passing sensation, but it turned out to be something much more sinister. He started to notice that people around him were ignoring him, not even looking in his direction. At first he thought it was some kind of prank, but soon realized that he had become invisible. At first, John was elated. He could go anywhere he wanted without being noticed. He could listen in on conversations and watch people without them knowing. But as the days passed, he realized that his newfound power came with a terrible price. He watched as his wife and children went about their daily lives, oblivious to his presence. He followed them everywhere, but they never acknowledged him. He tried to talk to them, but his voice was unheard, his touch unfelt. As time went on, John became more and more isolated. He watched as his friends and colleagues forgot about him, as if he had never existed. He tried to reach out to them, but his efforts were in vain. The loneliness was unbearable. John spent his days wandering the streets, hoping for a glimpse of someone who would see him, but no one did. He was truly alone. As the months passed, John's mind began to unravel. He started to hear voices, whispers in the darkness. He saw things that weren't there, and he began to fear for his sanity. One day, as he was wandering through the city, he heard a familiar voice. It was his wife, calling out his name. He turned around, but she was nowhere to be seen. He followed the sound of her voice, desperate for any kind of contact. But the voice led him to an abandoned building, dark and foreboding. John hesitated, but his desperation overpowered his fear. He entered the building, his heart racing. John was trapped in the darkness, surrounded by the whispers of the forgotten. He felt a chill run down his spine, and he knew that he was in grave danger.
John, can you hear me?
John tried to respond, but his voice was weak and barely audible. "I'm here," he said, his heart racing with hope. His wife's hand reached out and touched his shoulder. He felt her warmth, her presence, and it was like a ray of light in the darkness. Slowly, she guided him out of the darkness and into the light. As they emerged into the daylight, John looked around and saw that he was surrounded by the people he had once known. They were all staring at him in disbelief, shock, and wonder. "I'm here," he said again, his voice stronger this time. His wife hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face.
"I never forgot about you."
The people around him began to approach him, asking him questions, touching him, trying to understand what had happened to him. John was overwhelmed with emotion, and he could feel his power waning. He was no longer invisible. From that day forward, John lived his life differently. He knew that he had been given a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. He became more present, more engaged with the people around him, and he never forgot what it was like to be forgotten. Years later, when he was an old man, John would tell the story of his invisible days to his grandchildren. They would listen in awe, and they would never forget the lesson that he taught them, that the power of presence is one of the most valuable things we have. James was a simple man who loved nothing more than watching TV. Every night, he would sit on his couch, remote in hand, and channel surf until he found something he liked. He was always on the lookout for the latest and greatest shows and commercials. One night, as he was flipping through channels, he came across a strange commercial. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The screen was filled with swirling colors and strange symbols, and a voice whispered eerie words that James couldn't quite make out. Despite the unsettling nature of the commercial, James couldn't bring himself to look away. He was transfixed by the swirling patterns and hypnotic voice. He watched the commercial all the way through, and when it was over, he felt a strange sensation in his head. From that night on, James was a changed man. He began to have vivid and terrifying nightmares every night, each one worse than the last. He would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding in his chest, but he couldn't remember what he had dreamed. During the day, he found it increasingly difficult to focus on anything other than the strange commercial he had seen. He would watch TV for hours on end, flipping through channels in search of the strange, hypnotic commercial, but it never came on again. As the days went on, James began to feel like he was losing his mind. He would see strange patterns and symbols in his peripheral vision, and he heard whispers that he couldn't quite make out. He started to become paranoid, convinced that he was being followed by something sinister. One night, James woke up in the middle of the night, covered in sweat and gasping for air. He felt like he was being suffocated by some invisible force. When he looked up, he saw a figure standing at the foot of his bed. It was the same figure he had seen in his nightmares, with swirling patterns and symbols covering its body. James screamed and tried to run, but he couldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and James could feel its icy breath on his face. He woke up the next morning with no memory of what had happened, but he knew that something was very wrong. He tried to go about his day as usual, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting to strike. Weeks went by, and James became more and more isolated. He stopped leaving his house, stopped answering his phone, and stopped watching TV altogether. But it was too late. The strange commercial had taken hold of him, and it wasn't going to let go. One night, as James sat in his darkened living room, he heard a whispering voice coming from the TV. He turned it on, and there it was, the strange commercial that had ruined his life. He watched as the swirling patterns and symbols filled the screen once again, and he knew that he was lost. The last thing James ever saw was the figure from his nightmares, stepping out of the TV and into his living room. It was the end of James's life, but the strange commercial lived on, waiting for its next victim.